Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford. Oh my God, and I almost just knocked over my whole crazy system that I have here. I have like a little tiny table on top of which is my suitcase, on top of which is the box that my hairdryer came in. It's a little unstable, people. Actually, probably not a bad metaphor for my state of mind at the moment. Anyone who's having a frustrating day or a morning or afternoon, just know you're not alone. But I am very excited to sit down today and to talk with you about this longtime favorite book of mine, Transit of Venus by Shirley Hazzard. I have been wanting to do a lecture on this for so long because this is a book that I read occasionally, and every single time I'm just absolutely shook. But this time I remembered that the reason I found this book is I was doing this workshop where you could submit a manuscript, and it was this married couple, and they were awful. The whole experience was terrible. The only thing that was good that came out of that 10-day long workshop was the fact that they recommended this book, which honestly almost made the whole thing worthwhile. And as I was reading it, I just could not wait to drop the lecture and could not wait to sit down and talk to you all about it. And as I do in my prep, sometimes I will listen to other people's podcasts on whatever book it is. I literally found one on the Transit of Venus. It's always shocking to me how few podcasts I can find on specific books. And it was so interesting because it was these two young women, and they really, I don't think, loved their experience of the book. And I came away understanding that this is a very subtle book. It is a book of incredible genius, but I might almost put it in like a To the Lighthouse kind of category, in the sense that you have to be a very careful reader. And you have to be someone who really, really loves exceptional prose in order to fully enjoy it. It is also a book, and the conversation that these women were having also attests to this. It is a book that you can read again and again and again because there are so many aspects of it that are incredibly well done, but again, many of them are very subtle. And for some reason, to me, this book always feels kind of summery, and I'm not even sure why. I think maybe it's the heat of Australia. Maybe it's because there are some kind of summery moments in the book, but it spans like 3 decades, and it is certainly not exclusively summery. In fact, it begins with that crazy storm, but it seems very fitting, some reason, for the middle of July. This is a good time just to let you know there will be spoilers today. We will be talking about this book in its entirety. Because the structure of the book is singular and is so incredibly well wrought, and it is something we're going to look at, it's important that we have the entire book in mind. This was also one of the most rewarding experiences I have had of going back and looking at the beginning of a novel once I had finished it. So for those of you who have not finished the book, if you don't mind a spoiler or two, which I never mind a spoiler, I'm always more interested in the how than the what. Much more interesting to figure out why something happened, how something happened, than what happened. If you're like that, listen on. If you finish the book, I really think you're in for a treat, because going back and taking a close look at the beginning once you have finished is incredibly satisfying. Those of you who like an agenda, today we're going to be talking about the title. The title, I always kind of just glossed over, and it actually was really fun to look at. We're going to take a close look at the first paragraph because I think it's a good example of Hazzard's incredible prose. We're going to talk about this narrator who's really interesting, nimble, not as neutral as it seems, and honestly, in some ways, like an oracle of truth. It's a really important presence in the book, and I think if you are not reading really carefully, you might miss some of the subtleties of this genius narrator. We're going to talk about the prose in general. We're going to talk about names. The names in this book are insane. We're going to talk about figurative language. We're going to talk about description. She just is like an absolute master of description. We're going to talk about motifs. Essentially, my argument about her prose is that it is poetry. My copy of the book is the Penguin copy, and the introduction is by Lauren Groff. She has such interesting things to say. She herself is a poet. She also is a short story writer, and she identifies some really interesting things in Hazzard that fit very nicely with this concept that really what we have here is a prose poem. I mean, don't be afraid. You guys know how I feel about poetry. It's not really my bag, but I love a good novel that really has very deep poetry underpinnings. We're then going to talk about the structure. The young women on the podcast they kept talking about like just like nothing happening and how they just were so confused. They could just kind of like never figure out what was important or what was happening. I would argue actually that a lot is happening. Sometimes it's very subtle, but sometimes it's really not. There's a lot of plot that's happening here. And one of the reasons why the scope of the work seems so broad and also so deep is because of this incredible structure. We'll take a quick look at that. And then we're going to close by looking at all of the stuff that we do not have time today to dive into, but that are things that even as I am mentioning them, I think you'll have a deeper appreciation of those aspects of the novel, even if we don't explore them deeply. Okay, we're diving right in with the title of the book. I'm actually not doing a bio on Shirley Hazzard. I don't know why it didn't jump out at me. She's Australian. I think she maybe doesn't get her due. She won a very big prize for The Great Fire, which is a novel that I read a long time ago and don't remember much about, which is maybe not the best advertisement for it, but I should probably revisit that. We are instead going to jump right into the title of this book. So the transit of Venus, I mean, in my mind, I was like, okay, obviously this has to do with something astronomical. I was literally going to say astrological. I'm so in my head about those two words, but this is definitely astronomical. It also, of course, has to do with the idea of love. And I sort of just left it at that. I was like, okay, whatever. It's some sort of, star thing. And then it is also some sort of love thing. But when I dug into it a little deeper, I was so interested. So one of the things I want to touch on is this ridiculous statement on the back of my copy, my Penguin copy here. It's right up at the top. It's in big letters. It is so stupid. Listen to this. It says, "The story of two beautiful orphan sisters whose fates are as moving and wonderful and yet as predestined as the transits of the planets themselves." I mean, oh my God. It's honestly just like doing this book so dirty that I just don't even know who pulled this cover together. Just underneath that, we have something very worthwhile from the Paris Review, which I find very reputable, and largely because I share many aspects of my book taste with the Paris Review. But they say one of the great English language novels of the 20th century. Now, that is something I can totally get behind. What bothers me about the first part is it seems kind of twee and kind of like too light. It also is really leaning into the idea of fate here. And in some ways, the book is very caught up in the idea of fate. For some reason, I mean, I'm not a big person who believes deeply in predestination. And in some ways, it felt like it was robbing both Caro and Grace, and frankly, Dora, frankly, all of the people in the novel, mostly the women, that this idea of predestination, the idea of moving and wonderful, and yet as predestined as the transit of the planets themselves, and that we are all sort of stuck in these orbits without any control, it sort of undermined this deeply feminist strain that I see all through the novel. So I was not wild about this idea of them being predestined to live a certain life just like the planets. And it honestly, that might have been the reason why I wanted to look at the title more carefully, because I was like, this whole commentary about the planets in their fixed orbits is not doing a lot for me. So astrologically, wow, I knew it. I knew it would happen. It happened. Astronomically, is that even the word? I think so. Astronomically, what happens in the transit of Venus is that Venus moves. Venus is the second planet from the sun. Oh my God, I'm hesitating because I'm unsure. Talk about being in my head. So when it moves between the Earth and the sun, you can see it, not with the naked eye, but astronomers can see it as a little black dot. It's the silhouette of Venus that moves across the face of the sun. This is something that is very rare. It happens in pairs, 8 years apart, and about every 100 years. I have in my notes here that the next time it's going to happen is 2117 and 2125. So what's important here is the idea of rarity, and what else is important is that Venus is obviously, maybe this is not obvious to everyone, but it kind of should be ever since that book, women are from Venus, men are from Mars, or maybe I got that backwards. But this idea of Venus as being very closely tied to love, but also very closely tied to women. So Venus is the Roman goddess of love and beauty. She is the equivalent of Aphrodite in the Greek mythology. So when we put these two things together, what we have is this idea of love and beauty as being something that is very rare and something that you have to look for very carefully. It is also something in the book that no one sees. And I loved thinking about that. Throughout the novel, we have lots of things that feel like short stories, which is something Lauren Groff touches on. There's a whole story within the story of someone from Europe who comes to South America probably 200 years before the 2117 crossing. He is someone who went because he was going to be able to see the transit of Venus in South America. And he waited 8 years there, which now makes more sense to me because presumably someone saw it and they knew that it would happen again in 8 years. And he went to the place where he would be able to see it. And then the weather was so bad that he couldn't see it. We also know that Ted Tice, there's a very important stream throughout the book of this idea of Ted Tice understanding that England is a very bad place for a telescope. And yet it's like this thing that he has to argue, that he has to kind of go against the establishment. And I think those of us who know like that there are a lot of telescopes in like New Mexico could maybe surmise that England is not the best place for one. But the important thing here is that no one is actually seeing the transit of Venus throughout the novel. So with this title, what she is underscoring is the rarity of love and the fact that within the scope of the novel, very few people are seeing it. There's also a very important line on page 80, sorry, 180, I can barely read my notes here, that says Venus can blot out the sun. And there are several different references you all know that I love as I'm reading to find, the actual word verbatim. There's a bunch of references to the transit of Venus and to Venus itself. And each one is very significant. But this one stuck out to me because of the importance. This idea, Venus in astronomical terms just looks like a tiny black dot moving across the sun. But this idea that love can blot out the sun really speaks to the enormity of romantic attachment. Okay, we're now going to open the book. I don't always take time to look at an epigraph, but I really want to look at the one here because it is so significant. It's a poem, which is just interesting to me because you all know that poetry is like not really my jam. But it is so fitting that I really like this poem. This is a poem that is very sort of clear in many ways. It is in French, so if you don't speak French, it might not be super clear. I also appreciate the fact that they're trusting that any reader has enough French to decipher this because they certainly surely did not offer you a translation. But it's the kind of poem that I love because it's really, really beautiful and is a very important message for us, but is also fairly clear. So it reads the following. J'ai rêvé tellement fort de toi, j'ai tellement marché, tellement parlé, tellement aimé ton ombre, qu'il ne me reste plus rien de toi. So I'm going to just attempt to translate here. I have dreamed so strongly of you. I have walked so far. I have spoken so much. I have loved your shadow so much that nothing of you remains for me. I'm just looking at this and like really actually wanting to do a very deep dive into all of the beautiful things that are happening here. And my translation certainly did not do them justice, but we're not going to spend the time. What I will say here is this idea of the shadow and this idea of having nothing left of someone. Literally, now that we have finished the book, is a pretty good summary of what is happening with what I would argue is the most primary relationship in the book. You can argue that the girls' relationships, Grace, Caro, and Dora, those are maybe more primary, but the main love story in here, for my money, is the love story between Caro and Ted. The love story, of course, between Caro and Adam is in some ways much more fulfilling within the scope of the novel. But this is absolutely Ted Tice. He has really dreamed so much of Caro that nothing is left of her. And it is very interesting. We're going to talk about this at the end. But the promise of their love together is outside the scope of the novel. At the very end of the book, she's going to Rome. She's going to meet him there. He has told his wife that he is going to go off with Caro. But we also know, because we learn on page 12, that he is going to commit suicide in a northern part of England. For any of you out there who forgot that, because honestly, it's kind of forgettable, this book is insane, because on some level, you're kind of ending on this optimistic note, and then, if you're a careful reader, you remember, in fact, that this is not going to end well. So I really loved this poem. It is by Robert Desnos. It is called also Le Dernier Poème, the last poem, which is also very elegiac and very sad. And before we dive into the novel itself and start looking at the language, I'm just going to take this epigraph one step further and kind of tie it in with the title. So if we're talking about the rarity of love, and here I'm not talking about, to my mind, the relationship between Caro and Adam is the kind of like mutually nourishing, positive, stable, long-lasting kind of marriage. Although I will also argue that it was fairly truncated. They found each other late. He died early. It was not productive in the sense that they had any children, even though Caro seems to have wanted children because she's bereft when she has her miscarriage. So, not even the relationship that seems kind of most satisfying is, in fact, satisfying in the sense of kind of your fairy tale vision of romantic love. Which, I mean, obviously, there are lots of different ways that love can be satisfying. I think like a really like ecstatic, really passionate short affair can be very satisfying. And in many ways, the transit of Venus is talking about that. But this is a book that is fairly concerned with the idea of lasting romantic love. And no one finds it. So if we kind of tick through all of the people, we have Grace and Christian. They're kind of one of the first couples that we see. And their marriage is fine, but it is not great. We also then have Christian not finding love with Cordelia. We have Grace not finding love with Angus. And then we move on to Carol. In the very beginning, she meets Ted. She's just like not that into Ted. She is, in fact, really into Paul Ivory. Paul, meanwhile, is going to marry Tertia. They are not going to find love. Caro and Paul, in many ways, do not find love. They certainly find some passion, which just like wrecks her and can, in many ways, be seen as like this incredible romantic affair. Although I would argue that the fact that there is so much darkness devoted in the book to their relationship is arguing that, in fact, it is not a successful romantic affair. We also find out, of course, that Paul is bisexual and that Paul was kind of looking for love with this young actor. And you could argue that Paul is not finding love with the young actor, certainly not. Also not with Caro, also not with Tertia. Adam, in some ways, yes, he finds love with Caro, but it's a little later. His first marriage seems very fraught. He has a wife who, in fact, takes her life. And then we have Ted, who's also not finding love, not particularly with Margaret, not with the prostitute who he is with during one very moving scene, kind of a pivotal scene, actually, in the book. The prostitute being the one who basically says, like, well, you should go and have sex with her. If you've been obsessed with her forever and you have never had sex with her, you should probably go and try and consummate this love affair. And again, you could argue maybe that at the end of the book, Ted has the promise of love. He is moving toward love, and yet it is outside the scope of the novel. We don't even find love in the second generation. So we have this next generation, Felix, who has cancer and who may be dying. We're not really sure. We hope he is not. We have Josie, who is Adam's daughter. And toward the end of the book, she's pregnant. I think she's going to Sweden or maybe Switzerland. That's terrible. I think it's Sweden. And there's talk about a partner, but we certainly don't get the impression, Hazzard is purposefully not giving us the impression that Josie is, in a really nurturing, mutual, exciting love affair. So all of that is to say, both with this epigraph and with this title, that Hazzard is giving us all sorts of indications that love is rare, that love is difficult to sustain. And in fact, everyone in the novel is sort of looking for this kind of connection, and very few people are finding it. And even when they do, it is for relatively short spans of time. I made it sound like we were going to dive right into the book after we talked about that epigraph. But in fact, I have to make another detour, which is through the names in the book. Lauren Groff makes this excellent observation in her introduction that there are all of these monosyllabic names. And when we think poetically of a monosyllabic word, it's one that has a lot of force. It's one that can stand on its own. It's usually a sound that's very striking. And in many ways, it's kind of blunt and it's really saying a lot. And wow, when you take a look at the actual names, almost every single name in the book is monosyllabic. And when they're not, it's very telling. And when you kind of start parsing what these monosyllables actually are, it is so fascinating. So much of Shirley Hazzard seems like it should be kind of like too much, like she's kind of hitting you over the head with stuff. And it never, ever feels like that. So we begin with this idea of Sefton Thrale. I mean, the idea Thrale, it's like kind of difficult to pronounce. In some ways, rail makes me think of his stick. He always has like his cane, which is obviously a very phallic symbol. He is a very patriarchal presence in the novel, but he's also failing. He's like a failing patriarch. So in some ways, we kind of have him flailing. We have this idea of Thrale as also like railing against something, which he always is. He and Ted are very much locked in this kind of battle of like the old guard versus the modern day progress. We then have Ted. So he's Edmund, but he goes by Ted. But more interestingly, this last name Tice, it's kind of like entice, but without the N part. So it's kind of like he's sort of impotent in some ways. It's like he's almost going to entice people, but he's not, because that first syllable is missing. We also have the idea that it almost kind of rhymes with nice, like nice Tice, which he is kind of a nice guy in many ways. And there is that adage about nice guys finishing last, certainly as compared to Paul. We then have Belle. So, Caro, Grace, and Dora all share the last name Bell. At one point, a bell rings in Paul's apartment when Caro is there, and the bell shattered the silence. So you have this idea of a bell as an alarm. You have this idea of a bell as something beautiful. You'd hear bells in like a church, something kind of sacred. You also have this idea of things belling outward. These are women who really would like to take up more space in the world and kind of do in certain different ways. Their names themselves, Grace, obviously is monosyllabic. It is the perfect name for her. She is graceful. It says everything we need to know about her. Caro, I was interested in. I don't love it. Like I wanted to love it more because I actually really do love Caro. Caro was not a popular character with the podcast women I was listening to. And maybe that's kind of universal. Maybe people don't really like Caro very much. I loved her. I found her totally inspirational in lots of ways. That strength and that independence was very compelling to me. But in terms of names, her name is slightly different. She's taken off the line part. So in some ways, I would argue that she is not following the line. She is not going to just like be predestined and just go ahead and do what fate is, what the planets are saying she should do in terms of her orbit. But I was also very interested in the fact that Dora and Caro are not that far apart. We obviously have the same two vowels, both have the R. In fact, they're very like similar. They're not quite an anagram, but almost, which I think is supposed to make us recognize, in fact, that Dora, who is like really not likable in many, many ways, she's not that far from Caro. It sort of shows us in some ways like the bullet that Caro dodged just by having been born a little later, by having had Dora in her presence. And certainly Caro and Dora both stand in stark contrast to Grace. We then have Adam Veil. So this idea of a veil, we have like a very bridal thing, but we also have this idea of a veil as like a safe place, like a glen, like a place where you might find some kind of refuge, you might find shade. And Adam, first man, like as in Adam and Eve, it's so kind of on the nose in some ways because he is, in some ways, she's discovering him as kind of this first man. Ted does not really, in the beginning, serve as kind of like a real man in her life. And in fact, Paul doesn't either because in many ways he is, already betrothed, literally, to Tertia, and he has a very kind of passionate but very shadowy presence for her. Whereas Adam is really kind of this first man who she can really attach herself to. And again, that idea of veil, he's very much kind of a refuge. We then have Tertia. So Tertia Drage, which first of all, rage, hello. Also like dread. It's kind of like Thrail. It's a little difficult to say, Drage. And in fact, Thrail and Drage are similar. They both live out in these like moneyed, she literally lives in a castle and the Thrails live in this big country house. So we have these kind of unusual and in the case of Drage, like very kind of difficult sounding last names. And then Tertia, of course, being the third thing, like tertiary, she is a point in a love triangle almost every single time we see her. Well, she is, because we have Paul and Caro and Tertia. We also have Tertia and Paul and his lover. We also have Tertia and Paul and her lover. So we have Tertia as being very tertiary. Then we have Angus Dance. Again, the dance part is like we have Dance, Veil, Drage, Thrail, Bell, Tice. All of them are these monosyllabic, very strong, but very varied different last names. In some ways, I loved the character of Angus Dance, and it was so sad when things don't work out for them. Just off the cuff here, I'm thinking of Angus in terms of beef, and I'm thinking of Angus as someone who's from the north. I think it's either Scottish, maybe Irish, but as being northerly and sort of not of the ilk of everyone else. But this idea of dance, that they might have the kind of connection that you would have dancing with someone, and yet it does not work out that way. And then we have a strain of last names that are not monosyllabic, but are so interesting. So we have Rex Ivory, who is a poet who, this is the structure that we're going to talk about. We see him at the beginning, and then we see him at the end. Both of those times are incredibly important. He is someone whose presence should be kind of felt all throughout the novel. And when he pops up again at the end on the television, while Mrs. Thrail is in the old person's home watching him, it is so kind of shocking, but also so appropriate. It's the perfect thing, which is like the thing that every writer is looking for, which is you get toward the end. It's not like a major plot point, but it's so beautifully done. And when he does pop up, on the one hand, you're like, oh my gosh, wait, this is kind of coincidental and crazy. you're surprised and you're like, oh my gosh, wait, here we're coming full circle. And then you realize, of course, we should be coming full circle. But so we have Rex Ivory, Rex, of course, meaning king. And he is obviously a fallen king. He is like the opposite of a king. So there's a lot of irony in that name. He's a prisoner of war. Even when he comes back from war, it's not working out well for him. A lot of this book has to do with the post colonial era. This is in the 1950s, which is kind of well after the English Empire, like the height of the English Empire is over. But you have all of these kind of shadows of colonialism and the idea of someone named King Ivory. Ivory obviously being something very colonial, something that the British people were trafficking in ivory from their colonies. The idea of King Ivory as being completely impotent and powerless is so fitting. Then we have Paul Ivory. So you have to think here about, first of all, the biblical part, but more importantly, this idea of a pall, of casting a pall over things. I mean, again, it should be too much and it is not too much. At one point, we have both Caro and Dora. We have them in relationships with men. And I love the kind of parallel between these two. These are relatively short-lived things, although for Dora, it's kind of a big deal. So Dora is with Major Ingot. So an ingot is like a piece of money, like a Spanish ingot. Oh, I'm fairly certain that's correct. Oh my gosh, all of a sudden, again, I'm doubting myself. It's a day full of doubt. If you were on the YouTube, if I'm not correct, I will go ahead and correct myself here. But the fact that she is marrying someone who is going to pull her out of her poverty, essentially, which is kind of a self-inflicted poverty, and that he is named Major Ingot, like major money, it should be way too on the nose, and yet it is not. And then we have Caro, who when she leaves Paul and she's incredibly bereft, at the beginning of her grieving of her romance with Paul Ivory, she meets someone named Nicholas Cartilage. Well, she met him before. Cartilage, I think, is how we should say that. I said it like cartilage because, in fact, he serves as sort of cartilage. He's kind of like between bones. Wow, that is not what I meant. There's a real sexual overtone there. But I just cannot believe like that she's using him as like connective tissue and kind of this temporary thing that is not really important and is literally naming him cartilage. And I don't know, maybe some of you out there are really digging into the names and maybe you have already thought all of this through. But if not, honestly, it's just a time to take a step back and realize that nothing in this book is unintentional, which is obviously the case with someone who writes as well as Shirley Hazzard. But it's important to realize that every single opportunity she has, she is taking to make this book incredibly rich with every single element having tons of resonance. Okay, now we are going to dive into the actual book itself. We're going to take a look at the first two paragraphs and then one paragraph that's like a couple of pages in. One of the things that Lauren Groff mentioned in her introduction in my copy, which is such a great observation, is that Hazzard is moving a lot of the verbs to the end of the sentences, which is something that a poet would totally notice. And it is so true. And I found not only do we have a lot of verbs toward the end of the sentences, but we have these very important words that are shifting toward the end. Part of the reason why that's so important, we have talked about this quite a bit. The end of a sentence, the end of a paragraph, the end of a chapter, they're really important, partially because all of the momentum of the sentence is leading you to that thing, but also because even if it's just like a period and you just have a quick little, like very quick break, that word is kind of lingering in your mind for a very quick minute. So here we're diving in. By nightfall, the headlines would be reporting devastation. I mean, it's so good. I mean, this is a book that right from the start is really telling us what it is all about, which is darkness. So we have nightfall, which is also tying into this idea of being able to see love, being able to see, maybe not in England, but being able to see the stars, being able to see the transit of Venus. And then we have the idea of headlines. This is a book that spans so much. We're beginning in the 50s, but we kind of dip backwards into time. We move all the way into the 80s. And in some ways, there is a lot of like news and a lot of like large scope things that are happening. So the idea of headlines and the idea of the breadth of this is really important from the start. But then, of course, we have at the end of the sentence, devastation. This is a book, I mean, if you're not into darkness, I'm not really sure this is the book for you, because here we are at the beginning being told by her that this is a book about devastation. So then we read on. It was simply that the sky, on a shadeless day, suddenly lowered itself like an awning. And, maybe as we're going through this, I'm going to pick out some of the figurative language so that later, when we're talking about figurative language, I can mostly just kind of list the ways that she does these unbelievable things. In this case, it's a simile, it's a comparison using like or as. And actually, Lauren Groff talks about this one. For me, it didn't work quite as well as it seemed to have worked for Lauren Groff because it felt like it was like a little bit too far afield in some ways. And it kind of took me out of the thing. I was like imagining an awning. And I was imagining, like, I'm like, how is the awning lowering? Is it like mechanical? Is it on a roller? Like, what are we thinking about the lowering of the awning? So if a reader is taken out of the text like that, if you have to think to yourself, like, wait, is this a motorized awning? Then you know, in fact, that it maybe is not for that reader the most successful simile. But we also, in the very beginning, have all of these incredible sibilants, so all of these S sounds. It was simply that the sky on a shadeless day suddenly lowered itself like an awning. So we have all of these sibilant sounds, and then we're ending with awning, which is a low vowel. We have this nasal. It's like a very kind of ominous sound in some ways, and it works so well. We're then going to move on to a lot of plosives. So we have a lot of sibilants in the first, and then the plosive is like a P sound or a B sound. So then we have this. Purple silence petrified the limbs of trees and stood crops upright in the fields like hair on end. So here we have, again, another simile. And I actually really liked this one because it reminded me of like Goosebumps. Like I felt like I could really see this kind of energy, and it made me feel kind of cold. I mean, not literally, but like it made me understand that suddenly the day would have gotten cold. Then we have whatever there was of fresh white paint sprang out from the downs or dunes or lacerated a roadside with a streak of fencing. So this is one thing that Hazzard does again and again and again. This is a kind of a minor example of it, but she articulates things that a reader may not have articulated for herself, and it is insanely great. Like in this case, I absolutely know what she's talking about. There's that kind of, especially on the East Coast of the United States and apparently in England, you have that kind of electricity that, like, I don't know if it's like ozone. I don't know why that just popped into my head. But this idea, like before a thunderstorm, when you have that sense of everything kind of getting darker and that ominous feeling of gray, and yet the white stands out in ways that's almost alarming. And honestly, I'm not sure that's something that I have ever really like recognized until I saw it in writing. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, that is that kind of ominous feeling of contrast that does alert us to some sort of alarming, impending weather change. It's also important here that we're ending with the idea of fencing. In some ways, this is a book that's very much about territory. It's about people creating boundaries between one another. We also have this beautiful downs or dunes. Fresh white paint sprang out from downs or dunes. And that was one of these things that to me seemed very poetical. When she's talking about this storm, I, who have read the book, know that we're going to be seeing it in the countryside. And so the dunes, to me, I was like, wait, why are there dunes here? Partially because she's talking about the scope of this storm, which we should see, of course, as a metaphor. But on some level, not only did it expand the idea of the storm, but I love downs and dunes. It's such a beautiful phrase that even if I was a little bit like, wait, where are we? It's just beautiful. And then to follow downs and dunes with the verb lacerated. I mean, a lot of people in this book are being lacerated in lots of different ways, but we move from devastation to lacerated. I mean, these are just like, devastation is obviously not a verb, but lacerated, it's so active and it's so evocative and it's so like painful. And very briefly, before we move on, the note about the storm, there's something called pathetic fallacy, which is a type of figurative language where the weather in an area is reflecting what's happening for the people. I mean, think of Gothic literature when you have like, the thunderstorm and suddenly like, the sky opens and rain falls. If a writer is worth her salt, that is going to, in fact, be indicative of what is happening for these people. They are being brought together by an act of nature. And in many ways, it is the storm and storminess in general, like chaos and devastation, and in fact, death, that are bringing these people together, which should tell you something about what is going to happen with all of these people. It's portending all sorts of chaos among them. So then we have this beautiful kind of wrapping up of this first paragraph. This occurred shortly after midday on a summer Monday in the south of England. I love that. So we have all of this drama, we have all of this beautiful poetic language, all of these evocative similes, and then we have this absolutely mundane statement that deflates things in the most beautiful way. Not everything in this book is high flown, which is part of the reason why the prose is singular and why it works so well. Again, I'll repeat it. This occurred shortly after midday on a summer Monday in the south of England. So England is the last word in the whole paragraph. England is very important. I mean, I think that's obvious when I say it like that. There's a lot of stuff about Sefton Thrale and Tertia Drage and the diminishing of the aristocracy and progress in England. But we also have this very mundane, right before this, a midday on a summer Monday. So here we have all of these M sounds. I think that's a bilabial nasal. My linguistics might be failing me. But we have all of this kind of murmuring sound and this Monday. It's like midday on a summer Monday. It could not be more mundane, which is speaking in part to the fact that this storm is coming into the lives of these people, these kind of ordinary lives of these people, and is really going to shake things up. So sure enough, we have the second paragraph. We're going to read through a little more quickly here. As late as the following morning, small paragraphs would even appear in newspapers having space to fill due to a hiatus in elections, fiendish crimes, and the Korean War. Unroofed houses and stripped orchards being given in numbers and acreage, with only, lastly, briefly, the mention of a body where a bridge was swept away. Okay, hugely important. If you are a longtime listener to the Fox page, you know that I would counsel you, if you want to read better, to just simply pay more attention. And certainly you should be paying attention to the opening of a novel. In this case, it is particularly rewarding because basically we have like a White Lotus thing here. We have a body who at this point doesn't seem super consequential, but because Hazzard is so good, we know in fact, or we don't know yet, but having finished the novel, we do, we know that this is very consequential, and she's going to tie all sorts of different strings up in a knot that essentially, this is such a tortured metaphor here, but the knot essentially has to do with this body. You also maybe should be suspicious that it is important because we have it kind of drawn out with only, lastly, briefly, the mention of a body where a bridge was swept away. Also, that kind of pile up of adverbs, only, lastly, briefly. They have commas. She does such good things with punctuation. But this pile up of adverbs, actually her adverbs are also incredible. I mean, any reputable MFA program will tell you to avoid adverbs, but if you're as good as Shirley Hazzard, you can just go crazy with them. But so we have this very kind of wide-scoped narrator who's talking about the storm in these kind of really large ways, giving us the scope of all of England, talking about dunes and downs, and then how it is all put into the media, and then ending with this body. And then after those first two paragraphs, which are so broad, we narrow in to what will become the focus of the book. That noon, a man was walking slowly into a landscape under a branch of lightning. So we're not going to dig in too deeply, but of course that is Ted Tice. And it is not simply that he is walking toward the house. He is walking slowly into a landscape under a branch of lightning. All of this should be too much. It should feel kind of overwrought and written, but it is absolutely working. So it's really interesting to go back and take a look at the beginning of the novel. Of course, we are reminded of this body, this very kind of White Lotus moment where we have a body, we don't know who has died, we are not sure of the importance of it, and yet it does become very important. The other thing that is interesting is we're beginning with this landscape, and then we are beginning with Ted Tice. And he is someone who ultimately is going to be very important, and obviously is very important at different points throughout the novel. But in some ways, it feels like kind of an oblique beginning. It feels like we're moving into this with a somewhat minor character, which he is not. But I would also argue that Hazzard does such a good job with minor characters. She does such a good job of widening, like having this very, very wide scope of the novel. And it's part of the reason why things can feel confusing, and part of the reason why readers maybe get frustrated and aren't totally sure like what's important and what's not important. But it's really part of the genius because we have this very wide swath of humanity, and we have all of these incredible articulations of truth and details about these people that end up being revelatory. So we're going to read these two paragraphs relatively quickly. The cheap suitcase oozed orange on the black and white floor while Ted Tice took off his raincoat and hung it on a stand as directed. So, of course, we have things being black and white, which is very symbolic. And then we have this idea of the oozing orange. It's in many ways kind of portending his death. This idea is almost sort of bloody. Also, of course, leaning into his poverty. And the idea that at the very end he's being directed to do all of these things, we don't know that until the very end of the sentence, but it seems kind of perfect in terms of telling us that Ted Tice is someone who, at least at this point, because of class issues, which are enormous in the book, is in a milieu where he is having to be directed and is taking direction. A smell of wet wool, of socks and sweat was pungently released in the coldly soaped and well-waxed void. So here we have this idea of life, and in some ways, like kind of a messy life. It's pungent, it's sweat, it's old wool, but which is not like super flattering, but nor is the idea of the coldly soaped and well-waxed void. I mean, this is like a pretty damning description of the space, but it is so beautiful. Well-waxed void. I mean, that's incredible. It's an incredible sentence. Okay, moving on. All these slow matters had taken seconds, and in that time it could be seen, too, that the hall was circular, that a bowl of roses stood on a table beside a usual newspaper, beneath a dark picture framed in gold. Under the curve of a stair, a door was open on a corridor of Persian runner, and above, on the arc of stairs, there was a young woman standing still. So we have this idea of circularity, of things moving around. I mean, you can see the orbit of the planet perhaps there. But there's also this idea of cycles of things moving around and around in terms of relationships, in terms of people, moving through things and coming back to where they started. Certainly that happens with Dora and Major Ingot. But also the idea of secrets that are sort of inescapable and that are moving around and around in circles of betrayal. We also have this bowl of roses. So flowers are very important. We're not going to dig too deeply into the idea of motif. That is a very poetic thing. She does such an amazing job with it. I'm going to kind of list some of the motifs later. A motif is simply something that is arising again and again. It can be an action, but often it is a noun. And these motifs, once you sort of sense them, they actually become very telling. So flowers are arising at very important points in the novel, and we see them here at the very beginning. They're associated with the Thrale household. They're associated with Caro and with Paul. And we do see flowers throughout as sort of being present at these very kind of momentous moments, often of conflict, sometimes of love, and they're different in all of these different circumstances, which is why it is so well done. Notably, we have Caro, who is the young woman, and she is standing still. Then we have this. Tice looked up to her. It would have been unnatural not to. He looked up from his wet shoes and his wet smell and his orange blotch of cheap luggage, and she looked down, high and dry. He had an impression of her body in its full dimensions, as if he had passed at the back and seen her strong spine, the black hair parting on the prominent cord of the nape, the fragile crease behind the knee. Her face was in shadow. In any case, it would have been too pat, too perfect, if she had been seen to be beautiful. I was looking for Tom, she said, and went away. Unbelievable. So we're not going to parse this too carefully, although I will say, one of the things that Hazzard does again and again, and you could write like an entire dissertation on this, there is so much wordplay, so much pun, and so much double entendre. This idea of her being high and dry, here, it's like an accurate description. He is wet and low, and she is high and dry, but the idea of being left high and dry is not great. We also have a lot of this black and white being repeated. She's very pale, her hair is very dark. We have all of these lines that are drawn, the line of her spine, the line of her part. All of this is speaking to things being very linear, in some ways to fate, but also things are very shadowy. So we have both black and white, but we also have the orange and we have shadows. And then I think we're going to have time to look into this, but this is the perfect example of this narrator as being very nimble and as being not quite neutral. So we have this kind of meta thing at the end where the narrator is like, it would have been too pat, too perfect if she had been seen to be beautiful. So she's not quite beautiful. No one in this book is quite anything. That's not true, actually. Tertia is very beautiful, but it's like not in a great way. Also, I think Grace is very beautiful in her own kind of subtle, mundane way. But then we have this, I'm going to talk about devastation. We have the thing that she says to him very first, and he's already, you can tell he's kind of already in love with her because of all of the things that the narrator has just told us. And literally, we have this line, I was looking for Tom, she said, and went away. I mean, it's crazy. Tom, of course, is very close to Ted, so you have this idea of her like almost looking for him, but not quite, and this idea of them, it sort of faded. This big kind of romantic moment, this kind of meet cute that's happening, and then it is deflated in the most devastating way. So I think you get a sense from the opening couple of pages of how lyrical, and I mean that in the best sense, and how telling and evocative this language is. This is certainly, in many ways, like a writer's book. And it really is one where if you dig into it and really pay attention, you're going to get the most out of it. If you're reading this really quickly and you're reading for plot, you will definitely be disappointed. But if you are appreciating these descriptions, it's just an absolute joy. So these descriptions, I want to dig a little more deeply into that. She's so incredibly good at telling us so much. On page 70, we have this very telling description of all of them. And as I'm reading it, I'm going to read it fairly quickly. I just focus a little bit on the narrator and how the narrator is kind of tipping their hand as we are moving through. Again, this narrator to me feels obviously very sort of omniscient. It is a third person narrator. It knows everything, but it has a little bit of sass. This is a narrator who has a little bit of an identity and is always revealing when there are these kinds of telling, kind of descriptive, biased statements. So on page 70, we have this very short couple of paragraphs that are so substantial. So here we have Paul Ivory was motoring down from London and should soon arrive. Motoring down, then in parentheses, motoring down was the professor's choice of phrase. Ivory's car would swoop up alongside Tertia's, which would almost certainly put it in the shade or in the wrong. So the cars are very symbolic. Tertia's is green, Paul's is red. The idea of them always being in cars and in separate cars, they're always on the move, they're never together. We obviously have the green light and the red light. And then this idea where she is really playing with language here, in the shade or in the wrong. I can't wait, said Tertia, meaning only that she would not. So this again is that kind of double entendre. It's not, she's not saying like, oh, I can't wait. She's like, I can't wait. And you don't know that as a reader until it is clarified, which is helping us understand that the people who are in the room with Tertia are also just beginning to kind of suss her out. I can't wait, said Tertia, meaning only that she would not. I dislike reunions. She would assert, I don't like animals. That's in quotation marks, and then out of the quotation marks we have this. She would assert, I don't like animals, or children, or the ocean, or the spring, confident that her distaste must have importance. So this is this fascinating thing where our narrator is actually completing her thought. It's sort of like filling out this thought that Tertia would have. It's going beyond the scope of the quotation marks of the actual dialogue to really tell us so much about her. Any contrary opinion must be, as she implied, falsely sentimental. Even so, she would not manage to put these two sisters in the wrong or shade. They were actually waiting for her to be gone so they might resume. So this is we have this echo of in the wrong or shade, but it's very interesting because it's flip-flopped. Before, the car put it in the shade or the wrong, and then now we have this idea of Tertia not being able to put the two sisters in the wrong or shade. So we have all of these pairs. We have Tertia and Paul, we have wrong and shade, we have the two sisters. And one thing I love is again and again, it's very obvious with Christian when he goes and visits them and they're just like not that impressed by him and they haven't like really like made the apartment spectacular and they don't seem to be like impressed or like really appreciative of the fact that he, who is definitely of a higher class, they're kind of not that impressed that he has like sunk to their level. They don't conceive of it like that. And every time we see them with Tertia, there is a strength to them. Tertia is used to people bowing down to her and people feeling less than her. And in fact, these sisters won't. There are all of these subtle ways where their strength is so apparent, but it gives you the kind of subtlety that you would have to experience in this kind of drawing room situation. And then it's made very clear in sentences like, they were actually waiting for her to be gone so they might resume. And that's interesting because we have this sense that the narrator is telling us what the women, what the girls are actually doing. So in a lot of the paragraph, we have a lot of information about Tertia, and then we're ending with kind of entering into the minds of the women who are just like waiting for her to go so that they can resume their conversation. So what I want to underline here is the way that Hazzard is using this very lyrical language, all of these really sort of beautiful combinations of syllables and words, but she's telling us so much in all of these subtle ways. It is subtle, and you have to read for those subtleties in order to fully appreciate it. But if you are reading that way, it is so satisfying. So I want to dip in just a little bit further into this incredible narrator. So throughout, we have this third person narrator. And what's astonishing is how nimble it is. It moves from the consciousness of one person to another in these incredibly subtle ways. And then we also have the kind of cagey, kind of sassy editorializing that we saw earlier that is so impressive and I think unusual. It's not something, usually if you have an omniscient narrator, the goal of that narrator is to be sort of invisible. And in this case, there are very subtle ways in which this narrator is kind of intruding in a way that is very appealing. So I'm going to read a little bit of dialogue here. It's just such an absolute gift to read this language. And this is when the Thrales are sitting down. It's the Thrales and Caro and Ted Tice, and they are talking about Paul Ivory. And this is dialogue, which is one of the ways where we see the narrator most clearly, because the glosses, so a gloss in dialogue is just, it's whatever words, it's like he said is the gloss. But this is a narrator that has glosses that are very telling. So all of the words that are outside the quotation marks. Okay, so we have this. The professor proceeded to elaborate his preference, deftly aligning fork and knife. Paul Ivory has already established some place for himself in literature, and is rising so swiftly that there is no telling where he may yet go. Ted Tice grinned, by no means defenseless. So here we have this idea, we're kind of in the beginning, we're with the Professor Thrale, who is like aligning his fork and knife, it's very rigid and it's very like Downton Abbey kind of thing. And then we're moving to Ted Tice, who is grinning and who is by no means defenseless. So that is something you can hear it. Ted Tice has defenses. The professor is not thinking about Ted as being defenseless. He's simply confident that he is kind of superior to Ted. So we have Ted Tice grinned, by no means defenseless. Like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, impossible to measure speed and position simultaneously. So he is certainly there, like kind of besting the professor with his own tools. And then we have, it seemed that Caroline Bell could giggle like other girls. So here, what we are having is we're still in Ted Tice's mind, because he's saying it's so Caroline is laughing because he's made this joke. But when he says it seemed that Caroline Bell could giggle, which, the grinning and the giggling is very kind of in contrast with Sefton Thrale, who's straightening his knife and fork. But then we have this idea that she could giggle like other girls. So this is Ted kind of observing her. Then we move on, and the professor is just like continuing as if Ted has not said anything. And is all but engaged. The professor was determined to prevail, to the daughter of our neighbor at the castle. Ted wondered what all but engaged might mean, and saw Caro smile with the self-same thought. He recalled the castle, its gray walls discouraging even to lichens. Seeing into their souls, the professor told them, it's a brave man these days who'll marry the daughter of a lord, with all you radicals around. This was meant for Ted and Caro, since Grace's way of quietly stacking the plates exonerated her. Yet it was Grace who looked up and said, perhaps he loves her. Oh my gosh, incredible. So we have so much characterization here. We have Sefton Thrale, who's, determined to prevail, and who's going to be talking all about, the castle, and he's going to talk about these radicals in what he hopes is this disparaging way. And we are very much in his mind when he's like shooting that comment, you radicals. What he means is Ted and Caro, and not Grace, because Grace is being helpful in a very graceful kind of way. But in fact, he's even underestimating her. It's absolute genius when she is the one who kind of pushes back against Professor Thrale. And the best thing about that is when she does push back against him, it's not in an expected way. She's not kind of pushing back as a radical. She's pushing back as a romantic, and says what ends up being kind of this ironic thing, but it's very like hopeful about like, oh, well, maybe Paul and Tertia are actually in love, which of course is kind of a laughable concept. So the point here being, we have this nimble narrator who throughout the entire novel is moving very deftly into the minds of these different people, but with all of this kind of verve and sass that makes it so fun to read. So we're going to move on now and talk very briefly about figurative language. I'm just going to kind of list all of the amazing things that she does. And then I do want to look at one passage just because it kind of incorporates a bunch of these things and is so beautiful. It's very short. So throughout, in terms of figurative language, we have kind of the usual things, which are like metaphor and simile. We have pathetic fallacy, which is when nature is sort of mirroring what's happening for the characters. We have lots of personification, which is so well done. We have a whole bunch of foreshadowing. I mean, in many ways, because the structure of the book is so intricate, we have foreshadowing that's very telling and very important. We have tons of symbolism. So there's a lot of phallic symbolism. We have a lot of canes. We have umbrellas, we have towers, all of these things are phallic. And one of the things that stands out to me most is all of this double entendre. She says these things like high and dry in the beginning is the perfect example. It's this cliched expression, and she's kind of bringing it to life by using it as an actual description. But we are also left to think of the pun. There is like at one point, Grace is dyeing her hair, but she's talking about dying, and it's because she's aging that she's needing to dye her hair. But this idea of dying, of course, relates both to her hair and to the idea of just dying. She's also kind of dying because she does not have any purpose because her boys are older, and she doesn't have a particularly passionate marriage, and Angus Dance has left. So we have all of these different very clever examples of figurative language. And honestly, I mean, I don't think there's probably a paragraph in this whole entire book that doesn't have some incredible figurative language at work. But I want to read this one part. It's on 161. It's two very brief paragraphs. It's so incredible. So in the middle of the page, this is when Paul and Caro are together. They've just arrived at his apartment for, their tryst. Okay, so we have these two short paragraphs. Caro lay dressed on the bed, and Paul sat beside her, preoccupied. His hand rotated on her breast, but from force of kindly habit, absently fondling a domestic pet. On the coverlet, her own hand lay open, upturned, extended to a fortune teller. She watched him with love that was like a loss of consciousness. Unbelievable. So, so good. Couple of things. I have to admit that the idea of his hand rotating on her breast, I was like imagining somebody like opening like a jar of peanut butter. Like I was like, what's happening here? Which, I mean, maybe that's kind of part is supposed to be kind of awkward. But the important thing here in terms of figurative language is he has this idea of his hand rotating on her breast. She, of course, is wanting to be, sexually involved right then. He's actually thinking about a play that he might write. There's a lot of play within play, just like a Shakespearean kind of thing throughout this novel, and it's all very important. But so we have this idea that he is, but then we have this metaphor. The way he's doing is absently fondling a domestic pet. So you have this metaphor here that is so good. And then right after it, we have this idea of her hand. She lay on the bed, and her hand lay open, upturned, extended to a fortune teller. So this is an example of a metaphor, because she's not saying her hand was like a hand extended to a fortune teller. She's saying it was. So in some ways, the difference between simile and metaphor here is important, because she's holding out her hand to Paul, and he is the fortune teller. In some ways, he does have the control, which is terrible. But then, so we have this paragraph that is describing them, and then we have this single sentence that a lot of this book is long, and a lot of the paragraphs are long and involved, but every once in a while, we have this punctuation with this beautiful sentence that is set off by itself. And in this case, she watched him with love that was like a loss of consciousness. So good. Incredible. Okay, we're going to talk about the incredible structure of the book. It's really important. Sometimes structure is important, sometimes it's not. Here, it's absolutely key. And then we'll close with a quick list of all of the things that we have not touched on today. So the structure of the book is fascinating. We have all sorts of different aspects. One of them at the very beginning is that we have this kind of present moment. It is the moment we begin with. It's the moment of the storm. And in many ways, we're kind of anchored to it. But right from the beginning, we have this incredible flexibility in terms of time and in terms of sequence and in terms of character. So I'm just going to just very quickly move through kind of the first 8 sections that happen. So we have Tice's arrival. If we look at that as kind of like 0, that's like moment 0, present moment. Then we go back 1 month and we learn more about what is happening with these people. Then in the 3rd section, we go back several years and we learn about how Christian meets Dora and Grace. So then we understand why, in fact, the Bell girls are at the Thrale's house. Then we move 1 month forward. So we're moving from that time when Ted walks into the house, we're moving a month forward to when Ted and Caro are driving around together. Then we move back all the way to 1938 and 39 when we have the girls' childhood in Australia. Then we have the same kind of, we go back to that moment 1 month later when Ted and Caro are together. But what's happening within that moment is Ted is telling her the secret of his German soldier. So we are both in the moment, which is kind of 1 month after Ted arrives, but we are also going all the way back in time to Ted's childhood. And then we move forward and all sorts of things unfurl. The point being, at the beginning, we have this kind of moment zero, and then she's moving us so deftly backward and forward. This might cause some confusion for people, but mostly I loved it. What she is doing with all of this backward and forward is filling us in on all sorts of details. And if you're a patient reader and you're someone who's paying a lot of attention, your interest has been piqued. And then she's backfilling all of this information in a way that's way more interesting than if she had just, done this chronologically. So it's really ingenious that we have this first moment. It's also incredible that we are beginning on page 3, which is the first page of the novel, with this dead body. And the reason why that is important is because it's mentioned very briefly at the end of the second paragraph, but then at the end of the novel, it takes on supreme importance. And the careful reader is just incredibly rewarded by that. We also have this interesting thing in terms of structure, where on page 12, we are told, so very early in the novel, we are told that Ted Tice is going to take his life, which is hugely important. I mean, this goes back to my idea about like, I'm more interested in like how things happen and why things happen and not like what happens. Because some people might be like, oh my God, the story's ruined because we already know that Ted is going to come to a very sad end. But I would argue that what she is doing is casting this incredible tension, because you're kind of like, wait, why? Why is he going to be that distraught? And also, every time that things start going well for him, you have this idea of this kind of tension and this kind of sadness, because you're like, oh gosh, this is feeling good right now, Ted, but things are about to get worse, which is so interesting. And one of the best things that she does is that we're invested in a few of these characters, kind of the main characters, and they have these incredible arcs. So we have, for Paul, who's kind of our splashier guy, he is with Caro, then he's married to Tertia, then we hear about his young lover, then he's kind of back with Caro, then he's back with Tertia. So we have this kind of arc. I mean, it's not so much an arc as like, it's like kind of an up and down kind of roller coastery type of thing. But the idea of the romantic relationships among these people really does give a lot of structure to the book. We also have that with Caro. So in the beginning, she has this kind of mild flirtation with Ted while she's really, in fact, infatuated with Paul. Then we have her with Cartledge. Then we have her with Adam, and then ultimately with Ted. So it's also important, obviously. Whoops! I just knocked my precarious situation with my computer here. It's also important, obviously, that she has a job. In the meantime, things are happening among the women. I loved it that in the beginning, no one thinks she's going to pass the exam, and then of course she passes the exam with flying colors. And as much as I think of this book as being very feminist, and I think of Caro in particular as being very independent and very feminist, really the book is concerned with her relationships with all of these different men. So in a book that's pretty long and broad, that has a pretty large scope, we have these mini arcs, but we also have these much larger arcs that are tying the beginning to the end. And you have to be a bit patient, because a lot of what happens at the end is going to make rewarding all of the stuff you had to remember from the beginning. But we also have these shorter arcs that are also very satisfying. Another aspect of the structure, and Lauren Groff talks about this in her introduction, is that Shirley Hazzard is a short story writer, and lots of the chapters that we see throughout the novel can be read like short stories. They have the kind of a short story structure. So I'm thinking here of like the chapter with Valda and how Valda, who is one of Caro's work people, one of her work associates, who is very feminist. Valda is asked to do, she's asked to sew on a button, which she is not that happy about doing, because that is not why she has been hired. And it feels very misogynistic. And so then she does this very cool thing, is like when her typewriter needs its ribbon change, she goes in and asks the man if he will do that, because that's kind of like this archetypal manly kind of fix-it thing, because it's a mechanized machine. Mechanized machine does not quite work. But the arc of that, the kind of parallel of that and the beauty of it, and how Valda's very memorable, partially because her name is so awesome. But that does feel very much like a short story. It has kind of the satisfying arc of a short story. I think maybe that might be part of the reason why people are like, wait, which is the important part and which is not? Another one that's like that is the description of Paul with his German soldier. This idea when he was so unhappy at his boarding school and he would walk 10 miles out to the ocean, I think it's 10. And there's that beautiful line about how it was enough to see such broad expanses to feel free because in the school he felt so unfree. That's not really the right word. He felt so captive. I don't know. But the arc of like why he helped the soldier, and then this idea of what happened to the soldier afterward, the German soldier, and this idea about ethics and all of the kind of ramifications of that are so beautifully done because we have what feels like a very satisfying kind of short story arc with this German soldier. It also feels like that when Paul Ivory is talking about his young lover and how the father of the young lover is like I don't know if he's like a lorry driver. I can't really remember. That's just like popping into my head because it sounds very British. But we have this whole description of their family and the young lover as extorting Paul and trying to get all of this money from him. That also feels very much like a short story arc. We have that incredible twist, which I totally didn't see coming. I mean, honestly, sometimes I wonder about my brain. But when he has the description of seeing the young man lying asleep on the riverbank, and then the other person walking by and witnessing all of this, and then of course it's Ted Tice. I did not put in fact together that it would be Ted Tice. I also was a little like, yes, I guess young men of that age probably sleep very deeply, but part of me was like a little suspicious that this was like a tiny bit too tidy, the fact that this guy would stay asleep. Although, what am I saying? One of my children, who's 23 right now, I mean, man, he could sleep through a lot of stuff. And then lastly, there are lots of examples of these short story things, but like the idea of those Latin American petitioners, that ended up feeling like a short story. So with this novel that really is very wide in scope, that has these really beautiful, entire novel arcs, there also are all of these kind of short story feeling episodes throughout the whole thing. And then the last thing I'll mention about structure, and this is a much smaller thing, I mentioned it earlier with the flowers. We have these little echoes that are so beautifully done. We actually saw one on a very small scale when it talked about putting someone in the shade or wrong, and then like 2 paragraphs later it was in the wrong or the shade. So you have this idea of things as being repeated verbatim or with a certain motif. So we have this idea of flowers. That is one of these large motifs that comes up again and again. But at one point, there's a kite that we see at one point, and then we see it at another pivotal point. Adam Vale's stick, his cane, comes at a bunch of different important points, one of them after he has died. So we have this idea of these things that show up, and that's a very poetic thing to sort of have this kind of motif, this kind of visual thing that often is repeated verbatim that keeps reappearing in a way that's very powerful. So all of these different aspects of structure are all kind of squashed together. I mean, any one of these structures would be incredible, but she's so good that she's got all of them functioning in a way that might be a bit overwhelming, but when you start parsing it, you realize just how difficult and intricate and how rich the structure is. Okay, we're going to end today by just talking about a few elements that I would have loved to have dug into more, but I think making mention of them, if you want to go back and reread The Sucker Man, it is so excellent to reread. But also, I think as I mention these things, maybe you'll appreciate them even retrospectively. So the first thing, and I have a bunch of quotations here, like a bunch of page numbers I wanted to look at, and I'm not going to do that. But what I have here is this idea of power. She talks about power so explicitly, and it is so awesome. There are a bunch of different times where, like Paul is tempted to do something where Caro is concerned, and she and our trusty narrator, I'm Shirley Hazzard, will say like he wouldn't do that thing because he didn't want to give her even more power. So we have this sense of different people as having power or not having power. There are all sorts of different ways. And the same person, Caro, at times has immense power, and then at other times seems totally without any power. And it is so fascinating. I mean, almost every single character, Sefton Thrale, who's like the old guard, the old patriarch. Ted Tice has power at times and doesn't at others. Paul, obviously, sometimes does and sometimes doesn't. He's literally being extorted by a young man. Adam is often seen as very powerful, but, ultimately dies. Nick Cartilage, I mean, I have him written down here. Boy, that would be an interesting. I don't really feel like he's got a lot of power throughout this book. And when we think of the women, when we think of Dora at times as having power and not having power, and the fact that most of the time when she does have power, it's because she's playing the victim. It's very interesting the ways that people get power. And Caro, I mean, gosh, up and down and up and down. I mean, this is a woman who I think mostly has a fair amount of power, but there are times when she's just absolutely bereft. Grace, I mean, it's a little more, her power is like a little more steady, I think, in some ways. Tertia is a very interesting person. Valda, looking at Valda as having power, which is very satisfying. Or Josie, who is, the next generation. This is a woman who has a fair amount of power. Then we have like Una, Cordelia, all of these minor characters, and every single one of them is a very interesting study in power or the absence of power. And I really love the way that a lot of that is done so explicitly. This is not, it's not lyrical and it's not metaphors and whatnot. It's like explicitly talking about someone having power with the word power. Another thing she does incredibly well is pacing. So pacing is just like the kind of way that an author is meting out information. One of the times when it's most noticeable is there's a beginning of a chapter where she's talking about all of the things that are happening in the United States. I think Martin Luther King is shot, JFK is shot, all of these different things are happening. And she moves us through like a large span of American history in a way that is so deft and well done. Whereas at other times, she's taking a single moment and she's dilating it so that it slows way, way down. There's that incredible scene where Tertia comes in to her own engagement party and has the flowers and Caro is ironing. And it's kind of like, she has the long stem flowers, which she puts on, they're dead, and she's delivering them and it puts them on marble that's like a cenotaph. It's like they're like final resting place, their like grave kind of a thing, their tomb. And then we have Caro who's holding up that belt that's like a cobra. We have all sorts of different things. Tertia says the flowers need to go in deep water. And then that phrase is echoed when Caro does put them in deep water. And she sort of uses this phrase back to Tertia. We have another one of these double entendres. But it's a single moment, a very brief moment, and yet it's dilated in these ways that allow for all sorts of things to be revealed. So the pacing is incredible. We have all these incredible motifs. We've touched on a couple, flowers, for example, umbrellas, kites. Mothers are a motif that would be very interesting to take a look at, mostly the absence thereof. She does incredible things with punctuation, a lot of really interesting work with parentheses. There are a bunch of neologisms, not a lot, there's like made up words, there's just a couple of them. She also does this incredibly inventive thing. There are a few times where she'll end a sentence early, like she'll kind of cut off the last part of it in a way that is really deeply affecting. I mentioned it briefly, but there is a lot of play within the play. Paul Ivory is writing all of these plays that actually are very successful. And it's so interesting to look at them. Most of them are about Caro. And what Hazzard is doing there, of course, is underscoring certain things that Paul Ivory is kind of synthesizing, but also is synthesizing things for the reader. We have a lot of stuff about all of the classist things. Ted Tice is from working class, and the Bell Girls also come from kind of a lower station than the Thrales, and certainly than Tertia Drage or Paul Ivory. And class stuff is very important. But it's really interesting, too, to see how it does get kind of ironed out over time. Because indeed, we are beginning with this generation of radicals. And when you have Josie and Felix, you see classes becoming slightly less important. She does incredible things with time. We talked a little bit about structure, but the way that she moves so deftly around in time is so good. So those are all things that we aren't going to spend a lot of time talking about. And I actually feel good about that, because the thing that is most compelling to me, the thing that I think is so prominent and so important in this novel, is the language. This is prose that is unlike any other, and digging into it has been so satisfying. So whether you've read this once, whether you've read it many times, I hope that this deep dive allowed you to understand a little better why it is so satisfying and why it is such an incredible piece of work. It honestly feels like something I could do. We could do a weekly lecture on this for a year and still have so much to talk about. So today has been limited, but for me it was really fun, and I hope that you got a lot out of it and that you appreciate this book even more. So thanks so much for tuning in. Happy reading.